She grabbed him by the lapels of his luxury black tailored suit, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric as she pulled the 185 cm giant down to her level. Under the sharp, golden lights of the bistro, with the scent of high-end wine and the sudden metallic tang of drawn weapons in the air, she kissed him right on the mouth in full view of his entire elite security detail. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, because the man she had just claimed was Kang Jae-Min, the most feared mafia boss in the Seoul underworld. A man who hadn't been touched by a woman in 20 years. Not a handshake, not a brush of fingers, not even a formal greeting. Since his ascent to power, he had lived as a monk of the underworld, believing love was a luxury that would get him killed. His men called him the untouchable. His enemies feared even his shadow. But this woman, Amara Bennett, a 25-year-old waitress with glowing brown skin and eyes that held zero fear, had just done the one thing no human being on earth was supposed to survive. She kissed him, and the most terrifying part, he didn't pull away. Jae-Min, the Ice King, stood completely frozen, eyes wide and heart hammering against a ribcage that hadn't felt heat in 2 decades. To understand the terror Kang Jae-Min inspired, one only had to look at his hands. They were large, steady, and perpetually gloved in fine black leather, having never felt the warmth of another person's skin since he was a teenager. In the glass and steel heights of his Seoul headquarters, Jae-Min sat upon a throne of silence, ruling an empire built on the singular, chilling belief that human touch was a gateway to betrayal. For 20 years, he had been the Ice King, a man who treated his own body like a weapon, sanitized, lethal, and utterly unreachable. The morning of the bistro incident began like any other day in his frozen kingdom. A mid-level manager sat trembling across from Jae-Min's desk, pleading for mercy after a minor accounting discrepancy. Jae-Min didn't scream. He didn't even stand. He simply adjusted the cuff of his luxury black tailored suit, his eyes as dark and unreadable as the deep sea. The room's temperature seemed to drop as he spoke, his voice a low, melodic rasp that commanded absolute obedience without ever rising in volume. "You were trusted with the foundation," Jae-Min said, his gaze fixed on the man's shaking hands. "And you let it crumble." When the manager lunged forward in a desperate, tearful attempt to grab Jae-Min's sleeve and beg, the reaction was instantaneous. Jae-Min didn't flinch. 2 bodyguards moved like shadows, pinning the man to the floor before he could even come within an inch of the boss's skin. Jae-Min simply stood, smoothed his black dress shirt, and walked out. To him, a touch wasn't just a gesture, it was a breach of security. He had seen his father die because of a trusted embrace. And at 14, Jae-Min had decided that love was a luxury he would never afford. As his motorcade swept through the rain-slicked streets of Gangnam toward a territorial meeting, Jae-Min stared at his reflection in the tinted glass. He was 185 cm of lean, powerful authority, a man who had everything but felt nothing. He was the untouchable, a legend whose streak of isolation was his greatest pride. He had no idea that in less than an hour, the glass he had built around his life wouldn't just be cracked. It would be shattered by a woman who didn't care about his rules, his reputation, or the cold soul wind that guarded his heart. The high-end bistro was a cathedral of glass and hushed whispers until the moment the heavy doors swung open for Kang Jae-Min. He moved through the center of the room with a dominant, untouchable aura, his elite security detail fanning out like a wall of black suits behind him. Amara Bennett watched from the side, her white waist apron stark against her black dress, as the Ice King took his seat. She had heard the rumors of the man who ruled the city with a frozen heart, but as she stepped forward to fill his water, she saw only a man trapped in his own shadow. The peace shattered with the sound of a screeching van outside. Suddenly, the restaurant's front windows exploded in a rain of crystalline shards. "Police! Nobody move!" a voice bellowed, but the heavy tactical gear and unmarked masks suggested a far more lethal intent, a rival ambush disguised as a raid. Chaos erupted instantly. Jae-Min's bodyguards reached for their holsters, their faces twisted in a mix of shock and duty, but they were pinned down by a hail of suppressive fire. In the flickering light of the strobing emergency lamps, Jae-Min stood amidst the carnage, his sharp features illuminated by the muzzle flashes. For the first time in 20 years, The man who controlled everything was about to be caught in a crossfire he couldn't negotiate his way out of. Amara didn't think. She moved. She saw a group of gunmen sweeping toward the VIP section, their barrels leveled at Jae-Min's broad shoulders. She lunged forward, grabbing the lapel of his 10,000,001 suit and pulling him toward a shadowed alcove near the kitchen service door. The guards were distracted, one pointing a gun toward the entrance while another barked into an earpiece, their world falling apart in real time. As the lead gunman rounded the corner, his eyes searching for the boss's silhouette, Amara realized they needed a cover that no professional killer would double-check. She pinned the powerful, 185 cm giant against the wall, her deep glowing brown skin a contrast to his pale, stunned face. Jae-Min's eyes went wide, his lips slightly parted in a state of total paralysis as a woman's hands, uncovered and warm, touched him for the first time in 2 decades. Before he could process the breach of his no-touch rule, Amara tilted her head and pressed her lips firmly against his. She closed her eyes, projecting the image of a fearless lover caught in a desperate moment, while the gunmen glanced their way and, seeing only a trysting couple, hurried past toward the main hall. In that silent, heart-stopping moment, the Ice King didn't pull away. He simply ceased to breathe, his 20-year streak shattered by a waitress who was far more dangerous than any bullet. The ringing in Kang Jae-Min's ears wasn't from the gunfire or the shattered glass. It was the deafening roar of his own heartbeat. As Amara finally pulled back, her eyes wide and breathless, the silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. Around them, the bistro was a graveyard of luxury. His bodyguards stood like statues, their weapons still raised, their faces frozen in a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. They had just witnessed the impossible. A woman had touched the king, and the king had not struck her down. Jae-Min looked at Amara, his sharp jaw tight, his dark eyes searching hers for a hint of the fear that usually trailed him like a shadow. He found none. There was only a defiant, radiant confidence that made his skin itch under the fine fabric of his suit. He felt the phantom heat of her lips, a sensation so foreign it felt like a physical wound to his 20-year discipline. He was supposed to be the untouchable, yet he felt more exposed in this quiet alcove than he did in a room full of assassins. "Boss," his lead guard stammered, his hand shaking as he spoke into his earpiece. "The perimeter is clear. We need to move, now." Jae-Min didn't look at his men. His gaze remained locked on Amara, who was smoothing her white apron, her posture elegant even amidst the debris. She had saved his life, but in doing so, she had stolen his carefully guarded sanctuary. He knew the rules of the underworld. By kissing him in public, she had painted a target on her back that no amount of hiding could erase. To his rivals, she was now his greatest weakness. To his men, she was a glitch in the machine. "You," Jae-Min said, his voice a low, gravelly command that vibrated in the small space. Amara tilted her chin up. "My name is Amara." "Amara," he repeated, the name tasting like smoke and honey on his tongue. He turned to his head of security, his expression returning to that of the lethal, unreadable Ice King. "She comes with us. She is a security risk until I decide otherwise." The bodyguards exchanged panicked glances. Taking a civilian, a foreigner, no less, into the heart of the syndicate's stronghold was a violation of every protocol they lived by. But one look at Jae-Min's intense, wide eyes told them that the protocol had died the moment her lips touched his. Jae-Min reached out, his gloved hand hovering inches from her arm, hesitating for a fraction of a second before he motioned her toward the armored motorcade waiting outside. He didn't touch her, not yet, but as he ushered her into the dark interior of his car, the world outside seemed to lose its color. He was claiming the witness, but as the door clicked shut, locking them in a pressurized silence, Jae-Min realized he was the one who was truly caught. The gates of the Kang estate groaned shut, sealing Amara Bennett into a world of monochrome stone and suffocating silence. As she was led through the cavernous foyer, she realized the mansion wasn't a home. It was a monument to isolation. Every surface was polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the grim faces of guards who stood like statues in every corridor. There were no photographs, no stray books, and certainly no warmth. It was the physical manifestation of Jae-Min's 20-year vow, a fortress designed to keep the world from touching him. Yi-min walked several paces ahead, his broad shoulders tense beneath his black suit jacket. He hadn't spoken since they left the bistro, his aura so cold it seemed to dim the lights as he passed. When he finally turned to face her in the main drawing room, his expression was a mask of regained authority. "You will stay in the East Wing," he stated, his voice clipping each word with surgical precision. "You are not to leave your room without an escort. You are not to speak to the staff. And above all," he paused, his intense dark eyes flickering with a momentary, haunting vulnerability, "you are never to repeat what happened in the restaurant." Amara didn't flinch. Instead, she took a deliberate step into his personal space, watching as his bodyguards instinctively twitched toward their holsters. "Is that how you thank the person who saved your life, Yi-min, by locking them in a museum?" The room went deathly quiet. No one used his first name. No one stood that close without an invitation. Yi-min's jaw tightened, his strong posture stiffening as he looked down at her. He was used to people trembling in his presence, yet this woman, still wearing her white waitress apron, looked at him as if he were just a man, not a myth, not a monster. "I saved your life as well," he countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "My world is a graveyard for people like you, Amara. My traditions are what keep me alive." "Your traditions are making you rot," she said softly, her almond-shaped eyes scanning the sterile room. Without asking, she walked over to a heavy velvet curtain and pulled it wide, letting the moonlight flood the dark floor. "You've spent 20 years making sure no one can hurt you, but you've ended up in a place where no one can love you either." Yi-min watched her, his lips slightly parted in that same stunned expression from the bistro. She was breaking every rule of his household, bringing light into his shadows and defiance into his silence. For the first time in 2 decades, the Ice King found himself unable to give an order. He simply turned and walked away, his gloved hand trembling slightly at his side, realizing that while his mansion was built to keep enemies out, it had no defenses against a woman who refused to be afraid. The following evening, the great dining hall of the Kang estate felt less like a room and more like a tomb. A long, mahogany table stretched between them, a vast wooden desert designed to keep Yi-min at a safe, untouchable distance from any guest. He sat at the head, his posture rigid, watching as a silent server placed a plate of sterile, meticulously arranged sashimi in front of him. Suddenly, the kitchen doors swung open, but it wasn't a servant who emerged. It was Amara. She had discarded the white apron, but her presence was even more disruptive now. She carried a steaming clay pot, the aroma of garlic, ginger, and rich spices trailing behind her like a vibrant silk ribbon, cutting through the cold, scentless air of the mansion. "What is this?" Yi-min asked, his eyebrows knitting together as she set the pot directly in front of him, ignoring the expensive sashimi. "It's jollof rice and peppered chicken," Amara said, her voice warm and unapologetic as she pulled out the chair directly to his right, a seat that had remained empty for 20 years. "If I'm going to be a security risk in your house, I'm at least going to eat something that tastes like life." The bodyguards lining the walls shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to Yi-min. To sit at the king's right hand without permission was a transgression. To bring outside food into his controlled environment was a threat. Yi-min looked down at the vibrant red rice, the steam fogging his vision. For 2 decades, his meals had been prepared by nutritionists and tasted like nothing but duty. "I do not eat food I haven't cleared," Yi-min said, though the scent was making his mouth water in a way that felt like a betrayal of his discipline. Amara picked up a spoon, took a bite of her own portion, and then held another toward him. "It's not poisoned, Yi-min, it's just spice. Try it." The room held its breath. Yi-min stared at the spoon, then at Amara's steady hand. He realized with a jolt of panic that he wanted to taste it. He wanted to know the heat she carried. Slowly, as if moving through deep water. He leaned forward and took the bite. The explosion of flavor was immediate. It was sharp, bold, and unapologetically loud, everything his life was not. As the heat bloomed in his chest, Yi-min felt a crack in his icy armor so deep it was almost painful. He looked at Amara, her deep brown skin glowing in the candlelight, and for the first time he didn't see a witness or a risk. He saw a woman. "It is hot," he managed to say, his voice losing its sharp edge. That's because you've been frozen for too long, she replied with a knowing smile. For the rest of the meal, the Ice King didn't look at his guards or his phone. He looked at her. The silence of the mansion was finally broken, not by an alarm or a gunshot, but by the low, hesitant sound of Jae-Min's first real conversation in 20 years. While the warmth of the dining hall still lingered in Jae-Min's senses, a different kind of cold was settling into the lower levels of his empire. In a dimly lit private lounge across the city, the old guard, the veteran lieutenants who had bled to build the Kang legacy, sat in a circle of expensive smoke and hushed resentment. They didn't see a man finding his humanity. They saw a predator losing his teeth. 20 years of perfection, hissed Park, Jae-Min's second-in-command, his face scarred from a decade of street wars. 20 years of being the untouchable. And now he brings a waitress, a foreigner, into the sanctuary. He lets her feed him like a child. The men around him nodded, their loyalty fraying. In their world, a boss's heart was a liability that got everyone killed. They had followed Jae-Min because he was a machine of pure logic and ice. But the rumors from the mansion were spreading. The boss was staying home for dinner. The boss was letting a woman open the curtains. The boss was smiling. To the syndicate, these weren't signs of happiness. They were cracks in the dam. "The girl is a virus," another elder muttered, tapping a heavy gold ring against a glass of whiskey. "She has broken his discipline. If the other families see him softened by a pretty face, they will descend on us like wolves. We cannot afford an Ice King who is melting." Back at the estate, Jae-Min was oblivious to the brewing storm. He stood in the hallway outside Amara's room, his hand raised as if to knock, but he hesitated. His gloved fingers hovered over the dark wood. He could hear her humming a song, a soulful, rhythmic melody that seemed to mock the sterile silence of his home. Every note felt like a challenge to his authority, a reminder that he was no longer the only power in this house. But as he turned to walk away, his phone buzzed with an encrypted message. It wasn't a business report or a territorial update. It was a photo taken from the shadows of his own garden, Amara laughing through the window. Below it, a single sentence in Korean: "A king with a weakness is just a target." Jae-Min's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with the lethal intensity that had made him a legend. The old guard was no longer just whispering. They were threatening. He realized then that his 20-year streak hadn't just protected him, it had protected her. By letting her in, he had painted a bullseye on the only person who had ever dared to treat him like a man. The whisper of a coup was turning into a roar, and Jae-Min knew that the ice he had lived by was the only thing that could keep her alive. The invitation was printed on heavy, blood-red cardstock, and to the Seoul underworld, it was a declaration of war. The Red Banquet was an annual gathering of the city's 5 most powerful syndicates, a night of fragile peace maintained by tradition and terrifying reputations. This year, however, the atmosphere outside the venue was thick with a different kind of tension. Inside the dressing room of the estate, Jae-Min stood behind Amara, watching her reflection in the mirror. She wore a floor-length gown of midnight silk that complemented her glowing complexion, her natural hair styled in an elegant, intricate bun. For the first time in 20 years, Jae-Min was not wearing his gloves. His bare hands rested on the back of her chair, the skin-to-skin contact with the velvet upholstery, a reminder of how close he was to breaking his final rule. "They are waiting for me to fail," Jae-Min said, his voice a low vibration. "They expect me to hide you because I am ashamed or because I am afraid. Tonight, we show them neither." Amara turned, her almond-shaped eyes meeting his intense gaze. She reached out, her warm fingers grazing his jawline, the strong, sharp jaw that had remained untouched by anything but steel for 2 decades. "I'm not a secret to be kept, Jae-Min, and you're not a statue to be worshipped. Let them look." When the heavy doors of the banquet hall swung open, the collective intake of breath from 300 of the most dangerous people in Korea was audible. Jae-Min didn't enter at the head of a phalanx of guards. He entered with Amara on his arm. The Ice King, the man who had famously refused to even shake hands with the Prime Minister, was leaning in to hear a woman whisper in his ear. The music didn't stop, but the soul of the room changed. Park and the old guard stood in the corner, their faces darkening into masks of fury. By bringing a black woman, a waitress, an outsider, into the sanctum of their most sacred tradition, Jae-Min wasn't just showing his face, he was showing his heart. To the elders, it was the ultimate insult to their history. To his enemies, it was a roadmap to his destruction. Jae-Min led Amara to the center of the dance floor. As he placed his hand on her waist, the physical contact sent a jolt through him that made his vision blur. He was dancing on the edge of a blade, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the fall. He looked at the men who wanted his throne and saw only shadows. "Smile, Jae-Min," Amara whispered, her hand resting on his broad shoulder. "They're terrified because you look happy." But as they moved in a slow, deliberate circle, Jae-Min caught the eye of a rival boss across the room, a man who was already nodding to a waiter holding a tray of drinks. The banquet was a trap, and by showing the world what he loved, Jae-Min had just handed them the knife. The fragile piece of the red banquet didn't shatter with a bang. It dissolved in a heartbeat of calculated silence. One moment, Jae-Min was looking into Amara's eyes, feeling a warmth that made the 20 years of ice feel like a bad dream. The next, a tray of crystal glasses hit the floor, and the room's lights were cut into a suffocating, pitch-black void. "Amara," Jae-Min's voice roared through the darkness, no longer the melodic rasp of a boss, but the raw, panicked cry of a man whose soul had been exposed. He lunged for the space where she had just stood, his bare hands grasping only cold, empty air. The sound of a muffled struggle and the screech of a service door swinging shut echoed from the back of the hall. Jae-Min moved like a predator unleashed, his vision adjusting to the emergency red lights that flickered on, painting the room in the color of a fresh wound. He didn't find Amara. He found Park, his second in command, standing near the exit with a look of grim satisfaction. "I told you, boss," Park said, his voice devoid of respect. "A king with a weakness is a target. We've removed the distraction so you can be the man we need again." The transformation that followed was more terrifying than any weapon. The Ice King didn't just return, he evolved. Jae-Min's sharp Korean features hardened into a mask of such absolute, lethal intent that even his most loyal guards took a step back. He grabbed Park by the throat, his lean but powerful fingers tightening until the man's face went purple. "If so much as a hair on her head is touched," Jae-Min whispered, his voice vibrating with a fury that made the glass shards on the floor tremble, "I will not just kill you. I will erase every memory of your existence from this city. Where is she?" "The rivals, the Kim syndicate, they took the bait," Park gasped out, realizing too late that he hadn't saved Jae-Min. He had unleashed a monster that no longer cared about the rules of the underworld. Jae-Min dropped the traitor and turned to the room full of shocked Mafia leaders. He didn't ask for help. He didn't negotiate. He simply pulled a suppressed pistol from his waistband, the first time he had carried a weapon personally in a decade. "The banquet is over," he announced, his dark eyes glowing with a terrifying, unreadable light. As he strode out into the cold Seoul night, Jae-Min realized Amara had been right. He had been a statue. But statues don't bleed, and they don't burn. Tonight, he was going to burn the city to the ground to find the woman who had taught him how to feel, proving that the only thing more dangerous than an untouchable boss was a boss who finally had something to lose. The warehouse on the edge of the Han River was a skeleton of rusted steel and shadows, a fitting place for the Ice King's reign to either solidify or shatter. Inside, Amara was bound to a chair, her midnight silk gown torn at the hem, but her head remained high. Even with a rival's blade at her throat, she didn't look like a victim. She looked like a woman waiting for the inevitable. When the heavy iron doors were torn from their hinges, it wasn't a tactical team that entered. It was Jae-Min, alone. He walked into the light of the flickering industrial lamps, his luxury suit stained with the dust of the city he had just torn apart to find her. His bare hands were bruised, and his breathing was heavy, yet his aura was more dominant than it had ever been. He didn't look like a boss, he looked like a husband. "Let her go," Jae-Min commanded, his voice echoing with a finality that made the rival soldiers hesitate. "The untouchable has finally been reached," the rival leader mocked, pressing the steel closer to Amara's skin. Give us the shipping codes for the northern docks and she lives. If not, the Ice King loses his heart. Jae-Min didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his black leather gloves, the symbols of his 20-year isolation. He dropped them into the dirt. I am no longer the Ice King, Jae-Min said, his eyes fixed on Amara with an intensity that promised a new world. I am the man who is going to marry her, and a man with a family has nothing left to fear. In a blur of lean, powerful motion, Jae-Min moved. He didn't use the cold logic of a strategist. He used the raw, protective fury of a man in love. Within minutes, the warehouse was silent. He reached Amara, his hands trembling as he untied the ropes. For the first time in 2 decades, skin met skin not in violence, but in a desperate, grounding embrace. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her shoulder, finally letting the wall between him and the world collapse completely. A month later, the Seoul underworld was in shock, but for a different reason. Kang Jae-Min had abdicated his throne, handing the syndicate over to a reformed council with orders to go legitimate. The wedding was held at a private estate overlooking the ocean, far from the shadows of Gangnam. Amara stood in a gown of white lace that glowed against her deep brown skin, her hand locked firmly in Jae-Min's. As the minister asked for their vows, Jae-Min didn't look at the crowd of dignitaries or the guards he had left behind. He looked at the woman who had dared to kiss a monster and found a man. 20 years of silence, he whispered, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss to her lips in the bright afternoon sun. And it was all worth it for this one touch. The Ice King was dead, and for the first time in his life, Kang Jae-Min was finally free.